Good evening. Tonight, the Forbidden Dispensary opens with something softer, almost polite. A powder so modest you could mistake it for flour. A murmur in a royal audience chamber capable of bringing down a dynasty. Because behind jeweled crowns and overflowing banquet tables lies a far more intimate, far more patient kind of violence. The uncomfortable reality is that you probably wouldn't survive a single day there. Not from the blade or the plague, but from that constant gnawing dread that the hand pouring your wine might also be the one quietly ending your bloodline. Before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you honestly enjoy what we do at the Forbidden Dispensary. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see this strange little community scattered across the world. Now kill the lights and let's walk into tonight's story together. Our journey doesn't open in a laboratory or down a shadowed passage off a royal court. It starts in the ground itself. It begins with two brilliantly vivid minerals, bright and seductive. One glowed a fierce ruby red, known as realgar. The other shimmered in a regal sunlit yellow called orpiment. For thousands of years, these were arsenic's public persona. In the tombs of ancient Egypt, artisans ground them into fine powders, painting the golden sun across the walls of a pharaoh's final chamber, gifting an immortal mineral shine to the eye of Horus. In imperial Rome, women of rank blended the powders into hair removal pastes, harsh cosmetic brews that promised smooth, flawless skin-whispering beauty while carrying a silent elemental threat. They were tools of transformation, shifting the color of stone, the surface of flesh. But their true power, their deeper, more intimate talent for transformation, was only just beginning to be uncovered. Physicians in the ancient world regarded these minerals not simply as pigments, but as medicines. In the vast medical compendiums of early China, arsenic preparations were prescribed for skin diseases, parasites, and infections festering on the body's outer defenses. They embraced an idea of controlled destruction, that a substance fierce enough to burn away a blemish might, if handled with extreme care, burn away a sickness. On the opposite edge of the known world, the Greek healer Hippocrates in the 5th century BCE wrote of using similar arsenic sulfides to treat ulcers and abscesses. About a century later, Dioscorides, a physician serving in Nero's army, catalogued their properties in his monumental reference work, De Materia Medica. He described their caustic bite, their power to scour and cleanse wounds. But he also added a warning, a calm professional caveat. Swallowed, they became a vicious poison. This was a fact understood, but not yet widely exploited. The world recognized a harsh remedy, a brilliant paint, a practical material. The thought of arsenic as a deliberate hidden weapon was still only a seed, lying dormant in the dark soil of human creativity. For that seed to sprout, it needed the strange ecosystem of a medieval alchemist's workshop. There, in the half-gloom of oil lamps, among simmering vessels and mysterious star charts pinned to smoke-stained walls, arsenic's true nature slowly peeled back its mask. The alchemists were not hunting for a poison. Their ambitions were far grander, more mystical. They were chasing the philosopher's stone, the key that would transmute ordinary metals into gold and unlock perpetual life. And arsenic, this strange, self-contradicting element, seemed to hold some fragment of that secret. When they heated its compounds, something uncanny occurred. The yellow orpiment and the crimson realgar vanished, leaving behind a brittle grey metallic residue. This was elemental arsenic, isolated and bare. Albertus Magnus, the brilliant Dominican friar and philosopher, is often credited with clearly describing this process around 1250. He heated the ore with soap of all things and watched as something entirely new condensed out of the fumes. To him and his peers, this was sorcery rendered in glassware. This new substance possessed a remarkable talent. It could alter the color of other metals. Mixed with copper, it stripped the warm red metal of its blush, bleaching it into a bright silvery white. For a fleeting moment, it looked as though they had done it. They had turned a common metal into something that looked, to the untrained eye, exactly like silver. It was a maddening, tantalizing taste of alchemical success. They began calling arsenic the bastard metal, the poisoned sibling among the metals, a thing that never quite fit, neither fully this nor entirely that. In modern terms, it's a metalloid, a shapeshifter perched uneasily between metal and non-metal. That in-between nature sat at the center of its power in alchemy and, in time, of its power as a poison. The alchemists noticed yet another odd characteristic. When heated, its fumes carried a strong, unmistakable smell of garlic. A tiny sensory fingerprint left by something that would eventually become infamous for leaving almost no traces at all. They melted it, hammered it, and scribbled marginal notes about its ability to harden some metals while turning others fragile. Without realizing it, they were drafting a personality profile, coaxing out its secrets. And in the process, they accidentally produced the ideal tool for a new variety of crime. They refined it, purified it, and made it available in a form far more potent and predictable than the raw minerals beloved by the ancients. They arrived at arsenic trioxide, a fine, glistening, white crystalline powder. It had no taste, no smell, and with just a bit of coaxing, it would disappear into a glass of wine or a bowl of soup, leaving nothing behind but the promise of an ending. In their quest to master immortality, the alchemists had perfected the craft of premature death. They had forged the key, and it wouldn't be long before the locks it fit appeared along the corridors of power, on the cushions of thrones, and at the most exclusive banquet tables in all of Christendom. The age of the inheritance powder was stirring awake, to grasp why this modest white dust became the undisputed monarch of poisons, the silent accomplice to so many dynastic dreams. We have to leave the flickering lamplight of the alchemist's bench and travel inward, deep into the human body. We have to shrink ourselves until we're standing inside the cell, in the microscopic furnace where life is manufactured. Arsenic doesn't work like a sword stroke or a hammer blow. It isn't blunt or loud or crude. It's a saboteur, an infiltrator. It kills the way erosion does, quietly, patiently, from the inside out. It's an elemental hitman. Its primary tactic is simple: deception. Chemically, arsenic closely resembles phosphorus, an element absolutely fundamental to living systems. Phosphorus forms the backbone of molecules like adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, the universal energy currency of the cell. Every heartbeat, every flicker of thought, every breath is paid for in ATP. Your body's molecular machinery is designed to recognize and incorporate phosphorus in order to keep minting this vital fuel. When arsenic enters the bloodstream, it shows up at the cell's front door, carrying forged identification. The cell, fooled by the resemblance, admits it without question. And once inside, the quiet takedown begins. The poison heads straight for the mitochondria, those tiny intracellular power plants tasked with ATP production. It goes after key enzymes, the molecular workers managing a delicate chain of chemical reactions that turn food into usable energy. Picture a sprawling, intricate assembly line populated by thousands of highly trained workers, each one responsible for a single precise operation. Arsenic steps onto that factory floor and starts calmly sabotaging them. It attaches to them, warps their shape, and renders them useless. Belt by belt, station by station, the line slows, then halts. More specifically, it disrupts oxidative phosphorylation, the final and most efficient stage of ATP generation. Arsenic brings this phase to a complete stop. Suddenly, the cell faces an absolute energy famine. Its basic housekeeping systems falter. The membranes that carefully regulate the flow of water, ions, and nutrients begin to fail. Internal structures collapse. It is a quiet metabolic massacre, repeated countless trillions of times across every organ and tissue. The most vulnerable cells are those with the highest energy needs, the ones lining the stomach and intestines, the cells of the liver and kidneys, the tirelessly working muscle of the heart. That's why arsenic poisoning presents such brutal, yet tragically misleading symptoms. The assault launches in the gut. As the cells of the stomach and intestines begin to die, They trigger a desperate, panicked reaction. The body scrambles to expel whatever is killing it, unleashing crushing abdominal cramps, waves of nausea, and relentless vomiting. As the intestinal walls disintegrate, they leak fluid into the lumen, producing severe, watery diarrhea. And here we arrive at the masterstroke of arsenic as a homicidal tool. In a world that had never heard of bacteria, in cramped cities where sewage ran down the street and epidemics were simply part of the seasons, what did this violent tableau resemble? It looked like cholera. It looked like dysentery. It mirrored any one of a dozen lethal stomach and bowel plagues that routinely swept through towns, mowing down rich and poor without discrimination. A doctor in the 16th or 17th century, called to the bedside of such a patient, would see the vomiting, the diarrhea, the clammy skin, the weakening pulse, and nod with grim familiarity. Another gastric fever, an imbalance of bile, cholera morbus. He'd prescribe a useless purge or a dangerous bloodletting, and when the inevitable death came, he'd sign the certificate with a clear conscience. A tragic, natural demise. Arsenic supplied the perfect narrative written in the universal dialect of disease. It gave the killer an invaluable luxury, plausible deniability. Even better, the symptoms didn't always appear right away. Depending on how much was consumed and whether the victim had eaten, the first signs of trouble might be delayed for hours. Someone could share a cordial glass of wine with their heir, walk home feeling absolutely normal, and only notice the first twinges of pain later in the safe privacy of their own bedroom. By the time the real suffering began, the host of the evening's festivities was miles away, thickly insulated by timing and geography. The final act of the murder didn't require the poisoner's presence at all. As the hours pass, the cellular collapse snowballs. Fragile blood vessels begin to rupture, causing internal bleeding. The kidneys, already struggling with dehydration and exposure to the toxin, begin to fail. The victim is consumed by an agonizing, unquenchable thirst their injured organs can't satisfy. The heart muscle, starved of ATP, stutters and spasms before finally stopping. In cases of slow, low-dose dosing, a method cherished by the more patient and meticulous, the signs are even more elusive. A creeping fatigue, tingling and numbness in the limbs, hair shedding in alarming quantities, pale white transverse streaks, called Mises lines, appearing across the fingernails. To outsiders, the victim simply looks as if they're fading, succumbing to some long, mysterious illness. Their decline is mourned by the very person carefully measuring out their daily portion of poison. Arsenic wasn't just a toxin, it was a spectre. It entered silently, did its work, and imitated the natural processes of death so perfectly that the crime itself evaporated. This invisibility, this ability to wear the mask of ordinary disease, made it the weapon of choice for the ambitious, the resentful, and the remorseless. And nowhere did ambition and ruthlessness collide more violently than in Renaissance Italy, at the dinner table of a particular family whose name still drips with rumor, the Borgias. When we say Italian Renaissance, we tend to picture radiant frescoes, sweeping domes, and the polite revival of classical wisdom. But underneath the polished stone and gilded ceilings, a different art was blooming. The discipline of political poisoning. 15th century Italy was a patchwork of rival city-states and papal territories, each clawing for control. In this unstable terrain, power was a flickering candle guarded by the sword, the treasury, and more often, the poisoned cup. And in this lethal arena, no clan wielded poison with more audacity or efficiency than the Borgias. Their saga plays out in Rome, not the Rome of pious saints and serene scholars, but one populated by mercenary captains, courtesans, and cardinals who acted more like feudal warlords. At the center of this nest of vipers from 1492 onward sat the family patriarch, Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia. He was a man of immense personal charm, limitless ambition, and effectively zero moral restraint. He purchased the papal throne with outrageous bribes and fully intended to use its spiritual authority as a blunt political instrument to carve out a hereditary empire for his children. His favorite blade in this project was his son, Cesare Borgia brilliant, strikingly handsome, and possessed of a calculated reptilian cruelty that unsettled even hardened mercenaries. Together, father and son formed an almost seamless partnership of strategy and execution. Their preferred means of removing obstacles was a substance whispered through Vatican corridors, rumored to be a proprietary family formula, a concoction known as cantarella. Its precise recipe remains opaque, the subject of centuries of gossip. But historians are almost unanimous that at its core was our old acquaintance, arsenic trioxide. Cantarella wasn't a clumsy tool, it was an institution, a tightly managed arm of state policy. The Borgias turned hospitality itself into a guided missile. An invitation to dine with the Pope was the pinnacle of honor, and for some, their last appointment. Picture it, a sumptuous feast in the papal apartments, the room glittering with candlelight. The tables sagging under roasted peacocks, gleaming fruit piled on silver, endless streams of fine wine. The air thick with incense and rare perfume. Among the distinguished guests sits an elderly, immensely wealthy cardinal, perhaps a little too independent in his politics, or perhaps merely inconveniently rich in land and treasure that Cesare needs to fuel his next campaign. He's treated with flawless courtesy. The Pope may trade clever remarks with him. Cesare, with that easy, dangerous charm, might offer him a special glass of wine poured from a private carafa mark of favor, or so it appears. Or a servant, following very careful instructions, might serve a piece of fruit from a divided platter, one side harmless, the other side fatal. The delivery systems were as varied as they were clever. The Borgias were said to own hollow rings containing tiny secret compartments, allowing their wearer to flick a measured pinch of tasteless powder into a chalice with a casual gesture. Another tale describes a cunningly crafted key, one that would scrape poison into a goblet if turned to the left, but pour clean if turned to the right. This allowed the host to fill both his own cup and his guests from the same bottle, a gesture of ultimate trust that concealed the ultimate betrayal. For the marked cardinal, the evening would glide along pleasantly. He'd return to his residence content, belly full, suspicions absent. Only hours later would the familiar nightmare begin. Cramping, vomiting, savage thirst. His doctors would hurry to his bedside, frown thoughtfully, and declare a sudden stroke, a deadly fever, perhaps a malignant miasma caught from the Roman summer air. The cardinal would die in agonizing fashion, his passing chalked up to divine mystery. And then the Borgia machine would roar into motion. Before the corpse had cooled, papal officials would arrive to assert the Holy See's rights to the dead man's holdings. His lands, palazzi, tapestries, gold all smoothly absorbed into the church's coffers, which in practice meant Borgia control. The vacant cardinal's hat would then be auctioned to the highest bidder, pumping fresh money into Cesare's armies. It was a gruesome but ruthlessly efficient loop of liquidation and investment. For the Borgias, poison wasn't just revenge, and it wasn't merely personal. It was fiscal policy. It was their method of redistributing wealth. The rumored scale of the operation is staggering, though it's impossible to separate documented events from the dark legend later generations wrapped around their name. Cardinals, bishops, merchants, and rivals reportedly fell sick with suspicious convenience after crossing them. The low, constant dread that settled over Rome was itself a weapon. Men who might have raised their voices against the Borgias thought twice before accepting even a glass of water in their presence. And then, as if written by a dramatist who couldn't resist symmetry, there's the story of how it all ended. In the searing August heat of 1503, Pope Alexander VI and Cesare both became violently ill after a small dinner at the home of Cardinal Adriano da Corneto. The elderly pope, already 72, deteriorated quickly. He died in hideous torment, his body reportedly swelling and blackening so fast that witnesses swore the devil himself had come for him. Cesare, younger and stronger, survived but emerged weakened and broken. His influence evaporated almost overnight. The tale that's been repeated for 500 years goes like this. The Borgias had intended to poison Cardinal Corneto, But through either a servant's mistake or a deliberate betrayal, the cups were switched. They were destroyed by their own favorite technique. Modern historians argue over the details, some suggesting malaria or another fever. But the legend is hard to shake because it feels poetically right. It points to a deeper reality about arsenic. It has no sense of rank. It doesn't bend around crowns or scepters. Its quiet assault on enzymes and membranes proceeds with the same indifference in a farmhand as in a pope. The Borgias wielded arsenic like a ceremonial staff, using it to sculpt a dynasty. In the end, the inheritance powder, as people would later call it, left them with a grim inheritance of their own. A reputation drenched in fear, a family myth built on whispers of invisible dust, and a death that mirrored the many they'd orchestrated so well. Their poison-forged empire was ultimately dismantled by the very substance to which they'd entrusted everything. Even 1,000 candles, glinting back from 1,000 polished mirrors, couldn't fully dispel the shadows gathering in another seat of absolute power, the court of France. We move now into the late 17th century, into the gilded orbit of Louis XIV, the self-proclaimed Sun King. His palace at Versailles was its own cosmos, a rigorously choreographed stage where every bow, every sidelong glance, every murmured phrase might be a strategic move. Proximity to the king meant comfort, influence, and security. Falling from his grace was a living death. In this world, where social rank was oxygen, ambition rotted into something feral. And it was here, amid silks, powdered wigs, and the stink of rivalry, that arsenic claimed what might have been its grandest, most terrifying theatre yet. The scandal that would shake the monarchy didn't start in marble corridors, but in the crooked, filthy streets of Paris, in the modest dwelling of a woman named Catherine Monvoisin. To those who knew her, she was simply La Voisin, the neighbor. She worked as a midwife, a fortune teller reading palms and faces for nervous lovers and social climbers. But her real business, the one that made her rich and feared, was far more specialized. Her most valuable customers slipped through a discreet back door. Duchesses, marquises, counts, barons, and, if whispers are to be believed, members of the king's own inner circle. They came to her with problems that regular law and piety couldn't resolve. A rival for a lover's devotion, an aging father clinging stubbornly to life and, with it, to his estate. A husband whose ongoing existence had become a logistical and emotional obstacle. For predicaments like these, La Voisin offered an impressive catalogue. Love filters, powders to spark or suppress desire, and her most coveted product, poudre de succession, the succession powder, the inheritance powder. Its main active ingredient was, of course, our soft-spoken friend, arsenic. She prepared it like an artisan, blending it with ordinary-looking materials like sugar or flour, then packaging it in tiny, elegant parcels. The usage directions were chillingly simple: a pinch in the breakfast broth, a dusting in the evening wine. The program was gradual, a gentle ushering of the target toward an early grave. Nausea, cramps, exhaustion, the symptoms mimicked every common stomach complaint in that era. Another bout of gastric fever, the doctors would sigh. God's will, they would declare piously, and move on. This discreet trade might have stayed in the shadows forever if not for the theatrical collapse of one of La Voisin's particularly enthusiastic clients, the Marquise de Brinvilliers. Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray de Brinvilliers was an aristocrat of impeccable pedigree and catastrophic morals. She embarked on an affair with a cavalry officer named Gaudin de Sainte-Croix. Outraged, her father had Sainte-Croix imprisoned in the Bastille. That turned out to be his fatal misstep. It was there, in that fortress, that Sainte-Croix shared a cell with an Italian poisoner named Exili, reputedly a master of the Borgia tradition. When Sainte-Croix was released, he carried with him not just a thirst for vengeance, but a crash course in chemical murder. He and the Marquise began experimenting, honing their arsenic blends. To test their handiwork, the Marquise allegedly visited hospital wards, distributing bowls of soup and biscuits to the infirm, and then clinically observing their decline. Once she and her lover were satisfied with the results, she turned her attention homeward. First came her father. Over months, she administered the poison herself, nursing him with apparently devoted tenderness as he wasted away. No one suspected anything. Then, to secure her inheritance outright, she methodically eliminated her two brothers, serving them poison-laced pastries at a family dinner. Everything might have ended there, but in 1672, Sainte-Croix died unexpectedly of natural causes. In his laboratory, authorities discovered a small red leather case. He had left instructions that it should be delivered sealed to the marquise. But his creditors, hoping for valuables, opened it. Inside were not jewels, but vials of poison, letters from the marquise, and a full confession of their crimes. The marquise fled, but was eventually captured in a convent in Liège. She was tried and, in 1676, publicly executed. Her tortured confession painted a picture of cool, calculated murder at the loftiest levels of French society. It ignited a bonfire of paranoia at Versailles. If a woman of her station could do this, who else might be quietly doing the same? Who could be trusted? To contain the panic and dig into the truth, Louis XIV created a special tribunal, officially the Commission of the Arsenal, but remembered ever after by a far more ominous name, the Chambre Ardente, the Burning Court. Its charge was to investigate this underworld of poisoners, so-called witches, and their aristocratic patrons. The inquiry was led by the formidable chief of police of Paris, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, a man of cold intelligence and relentless resolve. For years, La Reynie and his network of informants followed trails that all seemed to circle back to La Voisin. In 1679, she was arrested. Under interrogation, she started talking. The names she supplied hit Versailles like cannon fire. What emerged was not a handful of isolated crimes, but a sprawling clandestine infrastructure, a murder for hire industry. La Voisin was not a solitary hag with a vial in her skirt. She was effectively the CEO of a death corporation. She had suppliers for raw materials, alchemists to prepare custom poisons, and a wide network of fortune-tellers acting as her sales staff, scouting for potential clients among the anxious and the resentful. She even arranged spiritual services, partnering with disgraced priests like Étienne Guibourg to hold black masses grotesque parodies of Catholic ritual meant to sanctify murderous intent. La Reynie's investigators traced these connections all the way into Versailles' most opulent chambers. They found evidence implicating high-ranking nobles, including the Countess of Soissons and the Duke of Luxembourg. Most explosive of all, the trail appeared to brush against the king's official mistress, the Marquise de Montespan. Allegations surfaced that she had relied on La Voisin for love potions to retain the king's affection, and that she might have participated in dark rituals, even plotting to poison a rival for Louis's bed. The numbers were staggering. Over 3 years, the Chambre Ardente issued dozens of summonses and made 37 arrests. 36 of those people were condemned to death and burned. Others were locked away for life, but the investigation was now reaching too far, too high. If the king's mistress, the mother of several of his legitimized children, were formally tied to murder and sorcery, the entire political and moral foundation of his reign might crack. So in 1682, Louis XIV did what absolute rulers do when reality threatens the story they're selling. He shut it down, the records were sealed or destroyed, the official inquiry was over. The affair of the poisons ended not with a reckoning, but with an order. The murmurs, of course, never entirely vanished. The scandal had peeled back the veneer on a society rotted by obsession with power. A world where a pinch of white dust in a silver goblet was just another tactic. Arsenic, having proven itself invaluable in the palaces of the elite, was ready for its next act, one far closer to home. The theatrical blaze of the affair of the poisons eventually burned itself out. The official dossiers were hidden or burned by a king desperate to paste civility back over a deeply cracked facade. But once an idea escapes into the collective imagination, it doesn't go back easily. The message that filtered down to the streets and the countryside was not, "Poison is monstrous." It was, poison is surprisingly effective, and you don't have to be a marquise to use it. As the 18th century rolled into the 19th, arsenic went through a kind of grim democratization. It trickled out of palaces and into cramped city apartments and farmhouses. It slipped into the hands of shopkeepers, farm wives, servants and clerks. It became the weapon of the middle class, and even more often, of women who had almost no other power at all. In a rigid world of class and gender, it was the great leveler. It even picked up a starkly practical nickname, inheritance powder. Its ascent was driven by one terrifyingly simple fact: it was everywhere. This was an era before controlled substances and prescription logs. Arsenic trioxide was woven into daily life. Apothecaries and general stores sold it as rat poison. It was infused into flypaper. Tanneries used it in curing hides. Manufacturers mixed it into brilliant green pigments for wallpaper and paint. Farmers dunked their sheep in it to kill parasites. And in one of the era's cruelest ironies, women used it in their beauty routines. A tiny measured quantity of arsenic, people swore, would lend the skin that fashionable translucent paleness and make the eyes gleam with feverish light. The preparation was even named, with a completely straight face, acqua tofana, after a legendary Italian poisoner. You could walk into a shop and for a handful of small coins buy enough arsenic to kill a dozen people. No forms, no questions. In many places, it was easier to buy lethal poison than certain books. This open availability turned the home into a potential crime lab. The kitchen became a chemistry bench, the pantry a covert arsenal, and the daily rituals of feeding one another, of sharing soup, bread, tea, took on a quiet new potential for horror. Think about the situations that were common then. An aging patriarch stubbornly clinging to the family business or farm, refusing to hand the reins to his middle-aged son. A wife trapped in a brutal marriage with no legal way to divorce and no money of her own. Half-siblings from different marriages, glowering at one another across the table, knowing only some will inherit. In scenarios like these, arsenic suggested itself as an answer, a calm, natural-looking answer. This was the poison of patience. It didn't demand courage or physical strength or immediate confrontation. It didn't leave stab wounds or bullet holes. It could be tuned and adjusted. A large dose produced a swift and excruciating death that looked exactly like a sudden intestinal infection. Cholera, perhaps, but the real artisans of domestic poisoning preferred a slower script. Small, regular doses stirred into food or drink over weeks or months. The victim would gradually fall ill. They'd complain of nausea, belly pain, weak legs. The family doctor would be summoned. He'd see a chronic stomach complaint, a nervous condition, a fragile constitution. He'd scrawl prescriptions for tonics and suggest rest. All the while, the caregiver, the wife, the daughter, the son would hover at the bedside, murmuring comfort, offering tea and broth and wine. Each small act of care another dose. That was arsenic's most disturbing innovation in the home. It weaponized kindness. It turned caregiving itself into a delivery system. The killer didn't have to sneak or break in. They just had to keep showing up with dinner. Who in that world would dare suggest that a devoted wife was poisoning her dying husband? Who'd accuse a grieving son of slowly murdering his own father? Suspicion did occasionally surface, and when it did, the resulting trials were national obsessions. But for every case that made headlines, we have no idea how many sailed by unnoticed, disguised as bad luck. In 1752, all of England was riveted by one such story, the trial of Mary Blandy. She was literate, unmarried, and the only child of a prosperous lawyer. Her father fiercely disapproved of her chosen suitor, a Scottish army officer. The officer allegedly handed Mary a mysterious love powder, claiming it would soften her father's heart. The powder was arsenic. Mary began slipping it into her father's gruel and tea. When he became violently ill, she panicked and tried to burn or throw away the remaining powder, but the damage was done. On his deathbed, her father is said to have looked at her and sighed, "Poor lovesick girl, what will you not do for that rogue?" Even he struggled to believe she had knowingly set out to murder him. Mary was convicted and hanged, transformed by the broadsheets into a symbol of a new, unsettling figure, the domestic poisoner. Yet her case only made it to court because she panicked and left a trail. How many others kept their nerve? We'll probably never know. It was a quiet epidemic of malice unfolding behind curtains and locked doors, eroding trust within families and communities. When a rich man died suddenly, friends would whisper. Wills were examined with new intensity. Relatives watched each other at the funeral, wondering who might have gained a little too much. The law was nearly helpless. Without a confession or blatant circumstantial evidence, prosecutors had little to work with. The body held the secret, but science didn't yet know how to make it talk. The core problem was forensic. How do you prove beyond doubt that arsenic killed someone days or weeks after they're buried? The symptoms were too generic. Once absorbed, the poison seemed to vanish into the body's chemistry. There were early chemical tests, but they were crude. One involved mixing the victim's stomach contents with charcoal and heating them. If arsenic was present and everything went just right, a faint metallic film might form. Another bubbled hydrogen sulfide through a solution of tissue. A yellow precipitate hinted at arsenic sulfide. These reactions were sensitive to contamination and easily misread. Any halfway competent defense attorney could shred them on cross-examination. The poisoner still held the high ground. Arsenic reigned unchallenged from its unremarkable throne in the pantry. But the age of steam, gaslight, and laboratories was dawning. Methodical investigation, the same force that was revolutionizing industry and medicine, was about to aim its lens at murder. In London, a quiet, tidy chemist was preparing to give the dead a new voice. The world was reordering itself. Steam engines shrank distances, gas lamps turned night into an extension of day. Chemistry was moving from alchemists' dreams into standardized procedures. And with that came a new question. Could science do more than describe death? Could it solve it? For centuries, poisoners were protected by a kind of chemical invisibility cloak. The law could punish a stabbing, a shooting, a public beating, but not a pinch of dust in a stew. That was about to change thanks not to a detective or a judge, but to an unassuming man in a military laboratory, James Marsh. Marsh worked at the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich, the sprawling British complex where cannons, explosives, and munitions were born. He was a practical chemist, more concerned with stability tests and blast pressures than with courtroom theatrics. But in 1832, a murder trial dragged him into a world he found both frustrating and motivating. A farmer named John Bodle stood accused of killing his grandfather with arsenic-laced coffee. The evidence was largely circumstantial, but strong. Marsh, as a respected government chemist, was called by the prosecution to test the old man's stomach contents. Using the best tool of the day, he treated the sample with hydrogen sulfide, which produced a bright yellow precipitate of arsenic sulfide. He believed he had what he needed, visual proof of arsenic. But court cases move slowly. By the time the trial started and Marsh was called to testify, the fragile yellow compound in his bottle had degraded. Its color had faded, its identity muddied. He tried to explain the chemistry, but all the jury saw was a dull residue. The defense attorney mocked his evidence as a chemical parlor trick. Bodle was acquitted. According to popular retellings, he then leaned over to a relative in the courtroom and boasted that he had indeed done it. For Marsh, that acquittal wasn't just a legal miscarriage, it was an insult to his craft. A killer had gone free because the language of chemistry had been too ambiguous. Marsh became obsessed with fixing that. He wanted a test so sensitive, so specific, and so physically persuasive that no juror could doubt it. He wanted the poison itself to sign the confession. Back at Woolwich, he set up his glassware and began experimenting. Existing tests tried to detect arsenic compounds, which were unstable. Marsh pivoted, isolate the element itself. He knew that when arsenic is exposed to nascent hydrogen, the reactive hydrogen formed at the very instant of a chemical reaction, it can become arsine gas, ASH3, a volatile and very poisonous compound. That gas became his doorway. Over 4 years, Marsh tinkered, failed, refined and simplified. What he ended up with was deceptively straightforward. The Marsh apparatus. A glass flask with a tube attached. Into the flask went the sample bits of tissue, stomach contents, a stain scraped from a plate. He added pure, arsenic-free zinc and sulfuric acid. The reaction between zinc and acid released a steady stream of hydrogen gas. If the sample contained no arsenic, this gas was just hydrogen, bubbling harmlessly out of the tube. But if even a tiny amount of arsenic lurked in the sample, it would hitch a ride, transformed into arsine gas mixed with the hydrogen. Then came the showpiece. Halfway down the glass delivery tube, Marsh applied the flame of a spirit lamp. As the invisible arsine passed through the heated zone, it broke apart. The hydrogen kept going, but the arsenic, now in its elemental metallic form, condensed on the cooler glass just beyond the flame. The effect was immediate and dramatic. A dark, silvery black mirror formed on the inside of the tube. This was not a color that might fade or a smell that might be forgotten. It was a tangible artifact, pure elemental arsenic, stable and visible. Marsh could break off the coated portion of the tube, label it, and hold it up in court. Here it is. The poison, summoned out of flesh and fluid, now wearing a metallic face, a literal mirror of murder. The Marsh test's sensitivity was astonishing for its time. Marsh showed that it could detect arsenic in quantities smaller than a grain of fine sand. He could find it not just in the stomach, but in organs like the liver and kidneys, and even in bone. Time, once the poisoner's trusted accomplice, had just lost much of its advantage. The body, it turned out, kept a record. The first major courtroom trial of Marsh's method came not in Britain but in France in 1840. The same Marie Lafarge case we visited earlier, but now as a forensic milestone. Marie, the unhappy young wife accused of killing her boorish husband Charles by dosing his cake, initially seemed protected by science's limitations. Local chemists, using older methods, failed to detect arsenic in Charles's remains. The defense smirked, but the prosecution had read the journals. They summoned Mathieu Orfila, the towering figure in European toxicology, to the little provincial courtroom. In front of judges, jurors, lawyers, and a packed public gallery, Orfila set up Marsh's apparatus. He took samples exhumed from Charles Lafarge's body. As he performed the test, the room watched in near silence as the clear glass tube blossomed with that unmistakable arsenic mirror glinting under gaslight. Orfila repeated the test on multiple organs and on the suspicious white powder in Marie's possession. Same result, same mirror. The defense tried a last-ditch argument. Arsenic was naturally present in the body, they claimed. Orfila dismantled this calmly. He demonstrated that the reagents and soil were clean. The only possible source was external, and the amount was far beyond any background trace. The verdict guilty echoed well beyond that town. The Marsh test, now battle-tested in the Lafarge affair, had crossed from laboratory curiosity into legal weapon. For the first time, chemistry had given the dead an absolutely clear voice. From that moment on, anyone contemplating arsenic as a perfect crime tool had to factor in the possibility that somewhere within the victim's tissues, a microscopic metallic mirror might be waiting ready to tell its story to a jury. In the damp autumn of 1839, amidst the grey fields of rural France, this forensic revolution met one last grand drama: the full story of the Lafarge case itself. Glandier, the estate where it took place, was a gloomy relic, its wealth mostly on paper, its owner drowning in debt. Charles Lafarge was a rough, uncultured ironmaster with financial problems. His new wife, Marie, was a city-bred orphan of good name but no dowry, nudged into a practical marriage that quickly turned into regret. Her letters home painted a picture of disappointment. She found her husband crude, his home decrepit, her life strangled by boredom. Charles, by contrast, appears to have adored her with clumsy intensity. Within months, he traveled on business, and Marie sent him a cake she had baked herself. a stereotypical gesture of wifely affection. He ate some and almost immediately became violently ill, but recovered. It was an omen everyone missed. When he returned to Glandier, Marie became his nurse. She prepared his food, drinks, and so-called medications. And slowly, relentlessly, Charles deteriorated. He suffered severe cramps, endless vomiting, and torturous thirst. The local physician diagnosed cholera, which seemed perfectly plausible at the time. But Charles's mother and another relative staying at the house began to notice details that didn't sit right. They watched Marie stirring an unidentified white powder into her husband's food. They intercepted a letter where she asked the local chemist for more arsenic acid, claiming it was for rat control. True, the estate did have a rat problem, but the timing and the secrecy made them uneasy. When Charles died in January 1840, the rumor mill was already grinding. Authorities ordered an autopsy. Local chemists examined the organs with the standard clumsy tools of the day, hunting for visible granules of arsenic. They found none and confidently declared the body clean. On paper at least, Marie was safe, but the family pushed. The public loved the scandal. The press cast Marie alternately as a cold murderer or a wronged romantic heroine. Under this pressure, the prosecution sought expert help from the capital, and that's where Orfila and Marsh's invention entered the story, turning a rural suspicion into a landmark case in forensic history. We've already watched Orfila's Marsh tests bloom with metallic mirrors in that courtroom. But what followed matters just as much. His testimony demolished lingering myths and forced courts across Europe to take chemistry seriously. Marie Lafarge received a life sentence with hard labor. She died a dozen years later of tuberculosis, still protesting her innocence. But for the scientific and legal world, her fate was almost incidental. The real headline was that Marsh's mirror had worked. Arsenic, the old invisible king, now had an unmistakable signature. And yet, even as laboratories learned how to pull arsenic from a corpse, living Victorians were enthusiastically wrapping themselves in it. While Orfila was demonstrating in a courtroom that arsenic could be teased out of organs, the Industrial Revolution was busy stuffing it into almost every corner of daily existence. The Victorian relationship with arsenic was schizophrenic. On one hand, it was the stuff of lurid newspaper stories and whispered scandals. On the other, it was as ordinary as wallpaper paste. Nowhere did that contradiction shine brighter or greener than in the century's obsession with one particular color. Green, but not just any green. A deep, dazzling, almost supernatural shade the world had never really seen before. Before the late 18th century, getting a bright, stable green pigment was difficult and expensive. Then, in 1775, a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele, the same man who first isolated chlorine gas and who unknowingly poisoned himself with his inventions, more than once created a new pigment while working with arsenic compounds. The result, soon called Scheele's green, was a copper arsenite. Its color was astounding, vivid, saturated, resistant to fading. A few decades later, an improved formula was developed, copper acetoarsenite, marketed as Paris green or emerald green. It was even more brilliant and more durable, and above all, it was cheap. The Victorian world, starved for vivid color after centuries of browns and grays, went wild. Arsenic green flooded high society. Fashionable drawing rooms were papered from floor to ceiling with intricate designs printed in those dazzling pigments. Celebrated designers like William Morris produced lush floral wallpapers in which every leaf and vine owed its life to arsenic. Owning a room enveloped in this vibrant green was a statement of taste and prosperity. There was only one issue: the walls were dangerous. The pigments were loosely bound to the paper. In damp climates like Britain's mold grew in the wallpaper paste. Those fungi metabolized the arsenic, releasing volatile arsenic-containing gases into the air. Even without mold, household wear and tear sent microscopic green particles drifting into the room with every brush of fabric, every slam of a door, every motion of curtains. Families grew mysteriously ill in their beautiful green salons. Chronic headaches, lingering nausea, skin eruptions, and a slow draining of strength became common complaints. Children especially suffered. They played in nurseries brightened with charming green patterns of flowers and birds. They breathed the dust. Some licked or chewed the walls, drawn in part by the pigment's slightly sweet taste. Doctors rarely connected these symptoms to the decor. The illnesses were blamed on damp, bad air, weak constitutions. Meanwhile, their wallpaper quietly poisoned them. Public health advocates like Dr. Thomas Auden in the 1870s documented case after case of families whose health dramatically improved once they moved away from arsenic-laced wallpaper. Industrialists pushed back hard, denying that their products could be at fault. The profits were too large, the colors too popular, and so the green paper kept selling. The poison seeped into more than just walls. That shimmering green showed up in clothing. High-fashion gowns were dyed with arsenic pigments that rubbed directly against the wearer's skin. Artificial flowers adorning hats and elaborate hairstyles were painted with Scheele's green. Every bob of the head shook loose a dusting of toxic powder. Children's toys were coated in cheerful green paint. Even food wasn't entirely safe. Confectioners reached for arsenic-based pigments to turn candies and cake icings into eye-catching shades of green. All of this produced a haze of exposure, a city of ballrooms and nurseries and sweet shops, all shedding microdoses of arsenic. It remained mostly invisible to those living in it until a catastrophe in a provincial English town forced everyone to pay attention. In 1858, in Bradford, England, a cost-cutting decision at a candy shop triggered one of the most infamous accidental poisonings in history. A local confectioner, William Hardaker, nicknamed Humbug Billy, sold cheap peppermint humbugs, popular with working-class families. To stretch his sugar supply, he used a filler called daff, typically harmless chalk or plaster of Paris. One day his supplier had run out of daff. A shop assistant was sent to a wholesale druggist to fetch more. The wholesaler, in a moment of fatal carelessness, took powder from the wrong container. It looked the same, a white powder in a barrel, but this was not chalk, it was arsenic trioxide. Back at the candy shop, 12 pounds of pure arsenic were unknowingly mixed into 40 pounds of sugar. Over 5,000 peppermint candies were made with that lethal blend. They were sold from stalls and baskets, bought by parents for their children and by workers on their way home. Within hours, people across Bradford began collapsing with horrific gastrointestinal symptoms. Over 200 were poisoned. 21, most of them children, died. The incident shocked the nation. The realization that arsenic was so ubiquitous, so poorly controlled, that it could accidentally be used as a food ingredient was a wake-up call. The Bradford candy disaster became a rallying point for those demanding regulation. It directly spurred Britain's 1860 Pharmacy Act, one of the earliest attempts to control the retail sale of poisons. Even as arsenic was killing people by accident in wallpaper, toys and sweets, others were voluntarily taking it in measured doses, chasing beauty. Arsenic remained a key ingredient in many cosmetic formulations. It was sold in complexion wafers and bottled tonics. The most famous was Fowler's solution, a standardized potassium arsenite mixture first concocted in the late 18th century. In very small quantities, arsenic can dilate tiny blood vessels beneath the skin, giving it a pale, almost porcelain glow. It smooths the complexion by inducing slight swelling that masks wrinkles. It can make the eyes appear brighter and more prominent. To Victorians obsessed with delicate, ethereal beauty, this was highly desirable. They took arsenic tonics as part of their daily regimen. They swallowed the inheritance powder not to kill anyone, but to sculpt their own faces into the fashion of the day. They were slowly, methodically, poisoning themselves in the name of vanity. It was the purest expression of the Victorian paradox. A culture that shuddered at the thought of being secretly poisoned by others was, at the same time, poisoning itself, with lace, with paint, with wallpaper, with health tonics. And yet, while all of this unintentional harm unfolded, another side of arsenic's story kept advancing in hospital dispensaries and doctors' offices. For as long as people had recognized arsenic as lethal, they had also suspected it might, in the right dose, heal. The entire medical history of arsenic is a story about dose and intent. The line between remedy and toxin runs so thin that Paracelsus, the 16th century Swiss physician and alchemist, crystallized it in a now famous maxim: all things are poison, and nothing is without poison. Only the dose makes a thing not a poison. Long before modern chemistry, healers in traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic systems, and European folk practice put arsenic to work on skin diseases, fevers, and parasites. But its true modern medical arc began in 1786 with the English doctor Thomas Fowler. Fowler formulated liquor mineralis, later widely known as Fowler's solution, a 1% potassium arsenite solution flavored and tinted with lavender. It was easy to make, easy to standardize, and easy to prescribe. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Fowler's solution became a pharmacological Swiss army knife. Physicians poured it onto every problem. It was prescribed for intermittent fevers when quinine wasn't available, for chronic skin conditions like psoriasis, for asthma, for anemia, and as a general booster for frail patients. Observant doctors noticed that in people with leukemia, a disease not yet well understood, arsenic sometimes dramatically reduced sky-high white blood cell counts, at least temporarily. But this came with a heavy cost. Long-term arsenic therapy carried side effects that read like a toxicology report: nausea, neuropathy, gum disease, and a greatly increased risk of various cancers. Doctors were perpetually trying to balance on a razor's edge: enough arsenic to tame the disease, but not so much that the cure became deadlier than the problem. For roughly 150 years, from the late 1700s well into the 20th century, arsenic remained in legitimate medicine cabinets, a testament to how far we were willing to push the dose makes the poison principle. Arsenic's medical high point, though, came in the early 1900s, not as a cure-all tonic, but as a precision weapon aimed at a specific microscopic enemy, the bacterium that caused syphilis. Before antibiotics, syphilis was a nightmare, a chronic, progressive infection that could disfigure, blind, and destroy the brain over years. For centuries, the main treatment was mercury. Patients went through mercury vapor baths, ointments, and pills. The side effects were horrific: drooling, tooth loss, nerve damage. The old saying went, "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." Enter Paul Ehrlich, a German scientist with an idea decades ahead of his time: the magic bullet. Ehrlich believed it might be possible to design a chemical compound that would hone in on a particular pathogen and kill it, while leaving the rest of the body mostly unharmed. It was the conceptual seed of what we now call targeted therapy. By 1905, researchers had identified the spirochete responsible for syphilis, Treponema pallidum. Ehrlich now had a target. He looked back to arsenic. He knew it could kill certain parasites and thought he might be able to harness that lethal force and aim it precisely. In a laboratory near Frankfurt, Ehrlich and his team began the grueling work of synthesizing and testing hundreds of organic arsenic compounds. Each new molecule received a number. They tested compound after compound on syphilis-infected rabbits. Most either didn't work or were far too toxic. Compound 1 failed. Compound 100 failed. Compound 605 failed. The project stalled. Ehrlich moved on to other research. The collection of failed arsenic compounds gathered dust. Then, around 1909, a talented Japanese bacteriologist named Sahachiro Hata joined Ehrlich's lab. Hata refined the methods for infecting rabbits and systematically went back through the shelf of discarded compounds. When he reached compound 606, an arsenic-based compound called arsphenamine, something different happened. The infected rabbits treated with 606 improved dramatically. Their lesions disappeared. The animals recovered. Compound 606, the one the team had overlooked, was Ehrlich's magic bullet. In 1910, it hit the market under the name Salvarsan, the arsenic that saves. It was the first truly effective treatment for syphilis. Salvarsan was not easy to use. The powder was unstable, required meticulous preparation and had to be given intravenously in a series of injections, painful and sometimes dangerous. Adverse reactions were common, but for many patients it meant the difference between a long, gruesome decline and recovery. For the next 30 years, until penicillin arrived in the 1940s, arsenic in the form of salvarsan and then neosalvarsan was the frontline weapon against the Great Pox. Ehrlich won the Nobel Prize. His magic bullet concept became the foundation for future antibiotics and cancer drugs, and arsenic, a substance synonymous with murder and court intrigue, briefly stood on the side of life, transformed by rigorous chemistry into a carefully aimed therapeutic. For a moment in history, the inheritance powder became, bizarrely, the healer's bullet. The grand poisonings of the Renaissance, the Borgia banquets, the whispered toasts in candlelit halls were high drama. They were lethal operas, staged for thrones and dynasties. But as the 19th century approached, arsenic quietly traded the palace for the parlor. It slid out of jeweled goblets and into chipped teacups. It left the domain of princes and settled into the cramped bedrooms and kitchens of ordinary people. In that new domestic theater, arsenic found its most prolific and perhaps most terrifying performers, the women next door. She was the dutiful wife, the grieving widow, the attentive mother. In the flicker of gas lamps in Victorian England, France, and America, she became something else entirely, a quiet, undramatic angel of death. The phrase history gave them is almost gentle, angel makers. It sounds tender, almost merciful, which makes the reality behind it that much more chilling. These were women, often poor and cornered by circumstance, who discovered in a few grains of arsenic a power they had never possessed. The power to reshape their lives, to erase burdens, to turn grief into income. The true catalyst wasn't only arsenic's easy availability. That was part of it. Yes, you could buy rat poison over the counter or scrape the active ingredient from flypaper. But the real accelerant was a novelty of the industrial age. Affordable life insurance. Companies began offering small policies to the working classes. Families could pay tiny weekly premiums for the right to collect a modest payout when a loved one died. These were meant as safety nets to cover burial costs, to keep survivors fed for a while, but they also created a new kind of commodity, the cash value of a relative's life. A husband, a child, a parent became, on paper, a small but tempting sum. In that grim economic climate, some women realized that a sickly child or a chronically unemployed husband represented an asset that had more value dead than alive. With arsenic at hand, the leap from insured life to collected payout became dangerously small. A cottage industry of death emerged. Take Mary Ann Cotton, whose name should stand beside history's most infamous killers, but remains strangely obscure. Her story doesn't unfold in London's gaslit alleys, but in the soot-smudged mining towns of northeast England. Over roughly 2 decades, starting in the 1850s, Mary Ann moved from town to town, home to home, leaving behind her an almost unbelievable series of natural deaths. She married, then remarried, then married again. Husbands with promising insurance policies developed violent stomach complaints and died. Children, her own and her stepchildren, succumbed to the same pattern: vomiting, diarrhea, collapse. Her mother sickened and died after a visit. In total, investigators later concluded she likely murdered as many as 21 people: 3 of her 4 husbands, a lover, her own mother, and around a dozen children. Her method was domestic simplicity itself. Arsenic went into the daily staples: tea, porridge, soothing starch-based gruels for upset stomachs. The symptoms she induced were indistinguishable from the dysentery, cholera, and gastric fevers that stalked Victorian households. Infant death was heartbreakingly common. Doctors were overworked and underinformed. A mother bringing in a limp, feverish child was met with weary sympathy, not suspicion. The pattern had a terrible logic. A husband's death meant an insurance payout, a new town, a new start. A stepchild's death meant fewer mouths to feed and another check. When money ran out or relationships soured, someone in Mary Ann's orbit tended to fall ill, and every time she played the role of the devoted caretaker. Her undoing came not from science at first, but from a slip in her mask. After the sudden death of her young stepson, Charles Edward Cotton, she complained to a parish official that she couldn't send the boy's body to a poorhouse because he is insured. It was such a nakedly transactional remark that it pierced his numbness. He reported it. An investigation followed. Charles's body was exhumed. Analyses revealed unmistakable quantities of arsenic. Mary Ann Cotton was tried, convicted, and hanged in 1873. The newspapers baptized her the Dark Angel. Across the English Channel, in the rural villages of Brittany, another woman carved out a similar legacy by very different means. Hélène Jégadot, a domestic servant who worked as a cook in household after household from the 1830s to the 1850s, brought with her an eerie pattern of misfortune. Wherever she was employed, people died. Employers, their children, fellow servants, even priests, all felled by agonizing stomach complaints after eating her food. Her specialty was a thick, hearty soup comfort in a bowl, laced with just enough arsenic to make it lethal over repeated servings. She bought her rat poison from local chemists who never questioned her. When those around her fell sick, she wept, prayed, and nursed them. Then, once they were buried, she moved on to the next position. Unlike Mary Ann Cotton, Jégadot didn't consistently profit from insurance policies. If there was a motive beyond an almost abstract taste for harm, it remains murky. She seemed driven less by money than by some deep, twisted need for control and drama inside other people's lives, a craving to stand at the center of every crisis. Rumors trailed her. People started calling her the poisoner behind her back. But in a culture that saw domestic servants as marginal, semi-invisible beings, those rumors took a long time to crystallize into action. It simply felt unthinkable that the woman making the soup, the one who fed the family, might be using that intimacy to erase them. These women, and many others like them, used arsenic as a weapon suited specifically to their circumstances. They lived in a world that granted them almost no overt power. But in the kitchen, at the bedside, with a spoon in hand, they commanded absolute trust. Arsenic amplified that trust into something lethal. It allowed them to conduct private, asymmetric warfare inside the family unit. They exploited roles that were supposed to be safe wife, mother, nurse, and hollowed them out from within. The angel maker was as much a cultural consequence as a criminal one. She emerged at the crossroads of cheap poison, unregulated life insurance, scientific ignorance, and patriarchal structures that left women economically and legally trapped. Arsenic didn't create her, but it gave her a frightening efficiency. And yet, even as arsenic perfected domestic murder, it was preparing to blow up on a far grander stage, as color, as commerce, as agriculture. The same industrial revolution that birthed life insurance offices in dreary neighborhoods also gave chemists new toys and factories new products. Arsenic, ever adaptable, rode that wave right to the center of modern life. We've already watched Shields Green and Paris Green, flood parlors, wardrobes, and candy shops. But the element's second act as pigment and pesticide didn't stop at wallpaper and sweets. It soon coated landscapes and lingered in the soil in ways no single poisoner, no matter how prolific, could ever match. We've talked about Sheila, the Swedish chemist who made arsenic green possible, and about how it lit up interior decorating and high fashion. The same brilliant hue that turned wallpaper and ball gowns into status symbols would go on to paint something else: human tragedy. One of the most famous question marks in that story is Napoleon Bonaparte's death. After his defeat at Waterloo, he was exiled to the remote, windswept island of St. Helena. There, in the dank, poorly ventilated Longwood House, he lived out his final years. The official verdict in 1821 was stomach cancer. But whispers of poison never let up. Who might have wanted Napoleon dead? Take your pick: royalists, British authorities, even mutinous supporters. In the 1960s, scientists analyzed preserved samples of Napoleon's hair and found arsenic concentrations far above modern norms. Conspiracy theories bloomed. Was he murdered with arsenic? Hair samples from earlier points in his life, however, also showed high arsenic levels, suggesting chronic exposure rather than a single fatal dose. Later, researchers examined fragments of the original wallpaper from Longwood House. The pigment used in its patterns, Sheely's green, that raised a different possibility. Perhaps mold on the damp walls of St. Helena slowly converted the wallpaper's arsenic into volatile compounds. Napoleon may have simply spent 6 years slowly breathing and ingesting the lethal decor around him. The image is almost comic in its bathos. The man who reshaped Europe, who marched armies across continents, reduced at last not by assassins or soldiers, but by heating, humidity, and fashion. An emperor felled by interior design. Outside the drawing room, arsenic green found another calling: killing insects. The same compound that made wallpaper brilliant copper as to arsenite was extraordinarily effective at killing pests when sprinkled on plants. In the second half of the 19th century, the Colorado potato beetle was decimating fields across Europe and America. Potatoes were a staple food. Crop failures meant hunger. Paris green, mixed with water or flour and dusted onto leaves, sent the beetles into oblivion. It worked so well that its use expanded rapidly. Entire fields were clouded in green dust. Orchards and vineyards received their own arsenic-based treatments, most notably lead arsenate. The short-term payoffs were undeniable. Harvests improved. Famine threats receded. Industrial agriculture gained a powerful ally. But the long-term bill was brutal. Factory workers making these pesticides inhaled arsenic dust daily and developed severe skin lesions, cancers, nerve disorders. Farmers applying the chemicals suffered chronic health problems. Rivers and streams downstream from treated fields became contaminated. Arsenic bound to the soil in orchards to such an extent that even decades after spraying stopped, the ground remained toxic. Some plots became what we now call brownfields land, so contaminated that reusing it safely is a complicated, expensive challenge. Arsenic had escaped the smaller confines of cup and plate. It now settled in topsoil, in groundwater, in sediments. The inheritance powder evolved into a planetary inheritance. Even as forensic chemistry and growing regulation pushed arsenic out of its throne as the go-to murder weapon, the element didn't vanish. It simply drifted into the background, into geology, infrastructure, and most tragically, the water supplying millions of people. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, forensic science and poison laws had made arsenic a risky tool for would-be killers. The Marsh test and its successors meant your victim's organs could call you out from the grave. Laws in Britain and elsewhere started tagging arsenic with colored additives and purchase logs. Poisons registers demanded names, addresses, stated uses. Arsenic ranked lower and lower on the shopping list for aspiring murderers. Other substances, plant alkaloids like strychnine and aconitine, then synthetic compounds, and later heavy metals like thallium offered advantages in stealth or novelty. But while arsenic faded from sensational crime pages, it lingered in quieter stories of leaky industrial sites, forgotten tanneries, smelters, and rail ties preserved in arsenic-based wood treatments. We'd moved from individual murders to something like a slow-motion, society-wide exposure. In one part of the world, that exposure produced what has been called the largest mass poisoning in history. And it started with the best intentions at a hand pump. In the 1970s, international health organizations descended on Bangladesh and neighboring regions of India, determined to combat waterborne diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. Surface water in ponds and rivers was frequently contaminated by sewage. Hundreds of thousands died every year. The solution seemed elegant and cheap. Tap the groundwater. Aid agencies helped install millions of simple, shallow tube wells pipes sunk into the earth with metal hand pumps on top. Villagers could draw what everyone believed was clean water directly from underground, bypassing the filthy surface sources. The campaign was lauded as a public health success. child mortality dropped. Fewer families watched loved ones die from diarrheal diseases. 2 decades later, physicians began seeing strange new patterns. Patients developed dark, speckled patches on their skin hyperpigmentation, especially on the trunk and limbs. They had thickened, painful nodules on their palms and soles, a condition called keratosis. Over time, rates of skin cancers, bladder cancers, and lung cancers appeared to rise. Many people developed cardiovascular problems and neurological symptoms. Initially, these were misdiagnosed as leprosy or other dermatological diseases, but the scale of the problem grew too large to ignore. Testing finally revealed the awful truth. The groundwater feeding millions of those tube wells was heavily contaminated with naturally occurring arsenic. The geologic makeup of the Ganges-Brahmaputra delta, rich in arsenic-bearing sediments washed down from the Himalayas, meant that under certain chemical conditions, arsenic could dissolve into the shallow aquifers. The act of drilling the wells and changing the underground environment had disturbed that equilibrium, allowing arsenic to leach into the water. The water coming out of the pumps looked clear and tasted fresh. It carried little microbial life, but it contained arsenic levels many times higher than safe limits. People weren't dying overnight, they were accumulating damage over years and decades. The triumph of switching from surface to groundwater had, by a cruel twist of geology, traded one kind of death for another. The numbers are staggering. Out of millions of wells in Bangladesh, a substantial fraction were found to be contaminated. Tens of millions of people, depending on how you count, perhaps 40 to 50 million or more, were exposed for years to arsenic-laced drinking water. The medical term for the resulting condition is chronic arsenicosis, a slow systemic poisoning affecting the skin, lungs, circulatory system, nervous system, and internal organs. Many of its consequences are irreversible. Responding to this disaster required an entirely different approach than catching a murderer. First came the mapping. Teams traveled from village to village with testing kits, sampling water at individual wells. Safe wells were painted green. Unsafe ones were painted red. The landscape itself became color-coded. Drink here, not there. But paint is not a solution. What do you do when your only local water source is marked red? How do you convince a family to walk miles to a green well every day? Do you build deeper wells which are more expensive but can sometimes reach safer aquifers? Do you set up complex filtration systems that require money and training to maintain? Do you harvest rainwater in sufficient volume in a place with long dry seasons? Bangladesh's arsenic crisis was not an isolated anomaly. Similar patterns have emerged in Taiwan, where a condition known as Blackfoot disease, a severe vascular disorder, was linked to arsenic-contaminated water. Parts of Chile and Argentina have long battled arsenic in drinking water due to volcanic and mineral-rich geology. In the United States, rural communities in places like the Central Valley of California, parts of the Midwest, and New England have discovered that their private wells contain arsenic levels high enough to warrant concern, especially when those wells tap certain bedrock aquifers. Layered on top of natural contamination is our industrial legacy. Arsenic from smelters, pesticide factories, wood treatment plants, and military sites. The element doesn't break down. It can change forms, move between water, soil, and air, but the atoms themselves persist. We've spent centuries concentrating arsenic in certain places, then acting surprised when it refuses to simply go away. So where does all of this leave us? After more than 2,000 years of using arsenic as pigment, medicine, pesticide, and weapon, what story does it tell back to us? To stare at arsenic's history is to look into a dark mirror polished by human hands. It reflects our contradictions more clearly than most substances. It is, in every sense, an alchemist's element, not for turning lead into gold, but for turning our intentions inside out. Start with beauty and death. Shields green, Paris green, and their cousins gave the 19th century its unforgettable visual drama. They brightened wallpaper and fashion, transformed drab rooms into immersive gardens painted by people like William Morris. They symbolize taste, refinement, and the triumph of industrial chemistry. But those same colors sickened children, ruined workers' health, and possibly hastened an emperor's end. The lovelier the room, the more insidious the atmosphere. Then there is healing and harm. Arsenic, in the form of Fowler's solution and later salvarsan, saved lives that would otherwise have been claimed by infections, skin diseases, and syphilis. It eased suffering in some cases and, for a time, represented the most advanced tool in the physician's kit. Yet the same molecule, differently dosed, differently delivered, has silently killed spouses, lovers, parents, and children. The physician's vial and the poisoner's paper packet often contained the same compound. The only real difference was why and how much. And of course, civilization and contamination. Arsenic helped us do things we couldn't do otherwise. It kept ship hulls and telephone poles from rotting. It preserved leather, strengthened glass, and shielded crops from pests that could have meant famine. It literally made modern infrastructure and agriculture more durable. But in doing so, it also salted the earth. Old orchards treated with arsenic pesticides turned into dead zones. Runoff from industrial sites carried arsenic into oceans and rivers, where it worked its way up food chains. Tube wells, installed to save children from bacterial diarrhea, ended up quietly seeding future cancers. Arsenic has never been inherently evil any more than fire, or lead, or radiation. It is ruthlessly neutral. Its moral weight comes from our decisions. Kings used it to secure power. Bankers and insurers accidentally incentivized its use in tiny domestic wars. Doctors harnessed it to slow leukemia and reverse syphilis. Chemists turned it into pigments that made rooms glow. Farmers deployed it to protect crops and then walked through the fallout. Aid workers drilled wells and, without realizing it, opened an underground vault of poison. In every age, arsenic simply did what arsenic does. We're the ones who shifted it from tomb paint to depilatory paste, from rat bait to tonic, from wallpaper to groundwater. The inheritance powder of royal courts has become a real inheritance in another sense. An environmental, medical, and cultural legacy we now have to manage. So what do we do with a story like this at the Forbidden Dispensary? We don't tell it just to horrify or to romanticize the poisoner's craft, or to wag a moral finger at Victorians for their wallpaper. We tell it because arsenic's path through history is a warning written in chemistry. It reminds us that every miracle material, every industrial shortcut, every miracle cure comes with trade-offs. It asks uncomfortable questions. What are we using right now in our food, our tech, our medicine that will be tomorrow's arsenic? What pigment, polymer, or particle will future generations look back on and say, how did they not see what this was doing to them? The quiet king of poisons may have lost his crown in the murder trade, but the element itself is still threaded through our world in soils, in aquifers, even in some medical treatments for leukemia today. Its reign never really ended. It just changed titles. In the end, arsenic's story is not about a villainous atom. It's about us, our ingenuity, our desperation, our lust for shortcuts, and our habit of learning the hardest lessons too late. A pinch of white powder, a cup of clean-looking water, a beautiful green wall. Each simple thing conceals a vast network of choices and consequences. And that's the sort of territory we'll keep exploring here at the Forbidden Dispensary. The dark, fascinating frontier where chemistry, history, and human nature grind against each other. So if you made it this far, you already know what I'm going to say. Be cautious about what you inherit, chemically and otherwise. Ask what's behind the colors on your walls, the ingredients in your tonics, the costs behind your conveniences, because the quietest substances are often the ones carrying the heaviest stories. And somewhere, just beneath the surface of our modern world, the ghost of arsenic is still waiting, patient as ever, for whatever role we choose to give it next. And so the quiet king began to lose his crown. There was no climactic duel, no poisoner unmasked with a melodramatic confession, no final banquet where every cup was switched at the last second. Arsenic's fall from its throne as the unrivaled poison of choice was as slow and methodical as its own mechanism of action, a gradual erosion rather than a violent collapse. It was toppled not by some new miracle antidote or a fearless detective, but by something far less glamorous: paperwork, laboratory glassware, and regulation. For centuries, arsenic's most dependable asset had been its invisibility. It mimicked common, often fatal illnesses with unnerving precision. It blended in with cholera, dysentery, gastroenteritis. It dissolved and dispersed in the body, leaving nothing obvious behind. It was a rumor in the bloodstream, a suggestion in the viscera. That ambiguity was its coronation robe, the thing that made it the king of poisons and the poison of kings. The first person to tug hard at that robe was James Marsh, the same Woolwich chemist we've already met. Marsh was no court intriguer, no romantic investigator. He was a man of scales, retorts, and reagents. But after being humiliated in court by the unreliable yellow precipitate of arsenic sulfide, he went back to his lab, determined to force arsenic out of the realm of rumor and into the realm of evidence. We've already walked through how he did it: the flask, the zinc and acid, the stream of hydrogen gas co-carrying arsine, the heated glass tube, and finally that unmistakable metallic film, pure arsenic, condensed as a mirror on porcelain. The Marsh test didn't just detect arsenic, it performed a show. It took the ghost and gave it a visible, durable body. Its first famous outing at Marie Lafarge's trial shook Europe. Watching Mathieu Orfila conjure a silvery black stain from the organs of a dead man was like watching a séance where the medium produced not a voice or a rapping table, but a piece of the killer itself. It turned toxicology into spectacle. The wider message was clear: arsenic was no longer an untouchable phantom. It was now traceable, demonstrable, cross-examinable. Poisoners, of course, adapted. They tried other elements, like antimony, which could also produce metallic mirrors under similar conditions. They hoped to confuse chemists or judges. But forensic science moved quickly. New protocols distinguished between arsenic and antimony deposits. Additional tests like the Range test, where a strip of copper dipped into a heated solution of the suspect sample acquires a dark arsenic film, added corroboration. As toxicologists across Europe and America began to correspond and codify, arsenic's chemical disguises wore thinner and thinner. At the same time, a different kind of chokehold was tightening around arsenic's neck. Bureaucracy, in its most literal ink and paper form, began to restrict access to what had once been as casually sold as flour or salt. In Britain, a series of sensational arsenic murders in the 1840s and early 1850s, many involving so-called burial clubs, where poor families took out cheap funeral insurance policies and then harvested them, sparked public outrage. The newspapers framed arsenic poisoning as a national plague. Editorials thundered. Parliament was forced to act. The Arsenic Act of 1851 did not purge arsenic from commerce. That was impossible. Industry still needed it. Farmers still relied on it. Instead, lawmakers did something far more clever in their dry Victorian way. They made arsenic conspicuous and traceable. First, the Act required that almost all retail arsenic be discolored. It could no longer be sold as a pure white powder. Vendors had to mix it with soot or indigo, turning it black or blue. That simple color change broke one of arsenic's favorite tricks: masquerading as sugar, flour, or baking powder on the pantry shelf. A cook could no longer plausibly mistake it for something edible. A poisoner could still use it, but now they had to explain why they'd bought blue or black powder in the first place. Second, the Act created a poisons register. Anyone buying arsenic had to give their name, address, and the reason for purchase. The seller recorded the amount sold and the date. The ledger became a quiet but potent deterrent. If someone died under suspicious circumstances, investigators could flip through those pages and see who in town had recently acquired arsenic, and for what claimed purpose. Overnight, the anonymous, casual purchase of the inheritance powder was gone. Acquiring arsenic now meant leaving a paper trail, one that could later lead directly back to you in court. Between the Marsh test in the lab and the poisons register in the shop, the casual poisoner's risk calculus changed radically. Other countries followed Britain's lead with their own versions of poison control laws. Pharmacists and apothecaries were brought under licensing schemes. Certain substances could only be sold in labeled containers. Some required signatures, others a doctor's note. None of this erased arsenic from the map, but it did push it out of the shadows and into a world monitored, however imperfectly, by clerks and inspectors. As a result, clever killers began to look elsewhere. The 19th century's burgeoning chemical knowledge opened up new options. Plant alkaloids like strychnine from Nux vomica and aconitine from monkshood, highly potent and for a time harder to detect, grew popular in both human and literary poisonings. Later, synthetic compounds and obscure metals like thallium odorless, tasteless and wickedly effective began to take their place in the black toolkit. Arsenic, once the default choice, started to feel old-fashioned. It was too well known, too heavily regulated, too easily recognized in the lab. By the early 20th century, it had slipped from its once unassailable top spot. Not erased, not harmless, but no longer the monarch of murder. Yet as with all dethroned kings, its influence didn't vanish. It seeped into the environment. The real story of arsenic in the modern era isn't about one person killing another. It's about an element embedded in the biosphere, lurking not in goblets, but in groundwater and dust. We tried, in a sense, to bury our sins. We dumped arsenic-laden slag and tailings in piles around mines. We let waste from smelters and tanneries leach into streams. We sprayed orchards year after year with lead arsenate, transforming once fertile soil into long-lived toxic reservoirs. We pressure-treated lumber with chromated copper arsenate and then sunk that wood into playgrounds, decks, and docks. We relied on arsenic the way earlier centuries relied on wood and iron, as an essential tool. But unlike wood, arsenic doesn't rot. Unlike iron, arsenic doesn't rust away into something benign. It persists. The crisis in Bangladesh is the clearest manifestation of that persistence, but it's only the most documented one. When international agencies installed millions of tube wells there and in West Bengal, it was an enormous public health experiment with one assumption. If you go a little deeper, the water must be safer. But water doesn't care about assumptions. It cares about geology and chemistry. The sediments beneath those deltas had been accumulating arsenic-bearing minerals for millennia. Under certain reducing conditions underground, arsenic remained locked within iron oxides in the soil. But human activity overpumping, changes in land use, and the mere act of drilling altered the oxidation balance in the aquifers. Iron oxides dissolved and released arsenic into the groundwater. Every hand pump that people gripped with gratitude for relief from cholera carried a hidden cost in its output. The tragedy is multi-layered. Aid workers did save millions from bacterial disease. They also unknowingly exposed millions to a different, slower form of death. Families who dutifully avoided surface ponds ended up drinking what amounted to a chronic cancer cocktail. Children who avoided diarrheal disease in their early years grew up into adults with heightened risks of heart disease, neuropathy, and malignancies. And even after the discovery, solutions have been frustratingly partial. Marking wells with red and green paint is simple. Providing long-term alternative water sources is not. Deep tube wells, arsenic-removing filters, piped surface water, and rainwater harvesting are all technically feasible. But they require funding, political will, maintenance, and education. Some projects have succeeded. Many more have faltered or been applied unevenly. Meanwhile, arsenic continues dissolving from sediments at its own slow, relentless pace. This is arsenic's final, unsettling chapter. It has become not just our poison, but our ecological legacy. The thing once spooned into soups has been scaled up into industrial tonnages and scattered over fields. Beyond murder trials and toxic wallpapers, it now exists as a kind of background radiation in certain landscapes. The inheritance powder has become an actual inheritance in a legal sense. something passed down from one generation to the next, inscribed not in wills, but in bedrock and topsoil and aquifers. Which brings us to the last and perhaps most important reflection. When the Forbidden Dispensary tells a story like this, about a single element twisting its way through art, medicine, agriculture, crime, and catastrophe, we're really telling a story about ourselves. Arsenic is not malevolent. It doesn't conspire. It sits in ores and sediments until we mine it, refine it, grind it, swallow it, paint it, or pump it into the earth. Its biography mirrors our own habits, our tendency to seek shortcuts, our hunger for power and beauty, our faith that problems can be solved by adding one more ingredient, one more technology. When we painted our walls with arsenic green, we wanted light and life indoors. When we dosed patients with Fowler's solution and Salvarsan, we wanted to push back disease with whatever tools we had. When we dusted Paris green over potato fields, we were trying to feed growing cities. When UNICEF and others drilled tube wells across Bangladesh, they were trying to stop children from dying of filthy water. In every case, the first chapter is progress. The second is unintended consequence. The question arsenic forces on us at the Forbidden Dispensary is simple, but deeply uncomfortable. What are we doing right now that will look, a century from now, like Sheila's green wallpaper or Paris green pesticide? What's our contemporary inheritance powder safe until it suddenly isn't? Is it a plastic additive leaching into oceans? A forever chemical in non-stick pans and firefighting foam? A pharmaceutical washed into rivers? A nanoparticle we haven't fully characterized? Future historians will have their own episodes to script. Arsenic's story doesn't close neatly. The element is still in clinical use today in carefully controlled forms, like arsenic trioxide for certain leukemias. It still appears in trace amounts in rice and well water. It still demands monitoring at old industrial sites. It still shows up in the margins of espionage law and conspiracy theories. It hasn't left the stage. It has just stepped into the background, into bit parts scattered around the world. The real ending belongs to us. The inheritance powder has taught us over and over that elements don't care why we use them. They only care how. An atom of arsenic behaves the same whether it sits in a pharaoh's tomb paint, a Borgias chalice, a Victorian wallpaper roll, a cancer ward infusion, or a Bangladeshi well. The variable is our intention and our foresight. So as we close this long journey at the Forbidden Dispensary, think of arsenic not just as a villain or an alchemical curiosity or the star of a few sensational crimes. Think of it as a cautionary mirror. It shows us what happens when we chase power, beauty, and control with incomplete knowledge and unlimited confidence. It forces us to ask whether we're willing to look beyond the immediate benefits of the substances we unleash, to ask what happens after the banquet ends, after the wallpaper fades, after the wells are drilled. Because if arsenic's history teaches anything, it's that the quietest agents often carry the loudest consequences, and that the most dangerous inheritance isn't always written in ink, but in the elements we scatter through our world, believing we've tamed them. This has been the Forbidden Dispensary. If you're still with me at the end of arsenic's long haunted trail, you already know why we do this. To understand what we've chosen and what those choices are quietly choosing for us in return.